name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium here at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. February of 2019 has been a special month for History Nebraska because of support from Humanities Nebraska and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. Over the course of this Black History Month, the support of these organizations has been essential. As we note each month, special thanks go to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. This month is really special for the Brown Bags and the Foundation. AARP Nebraska is paying the full expenses for producing the video. This is part of AARP Nebraska's support for and celebration of community events during Black History Month. AARP encourages passing on the stories of African Americans over 50 who have made and are making history. If you would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, and this one within a few days, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska. And you'll see a place that says See Playlists, and at See Playlists you will see Brown Bag lectures, and there are now 180 on there. Our topic today is Ross, Moss, Wins, and Loss, stories of Lincoln's early African American professionals. Our speaker is Ed Zimmer. Dr. Ed Zimmer is the Historic Preservation Planner for the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department. Just to let you know about asking questions, Ed prefers you wait until the end, unless you are just dying to ask. Please join me in welcoming Ed Zimmer.
We'll jump right in because I've not seen this show before, and I wonder what I'm going to show you and how it will go. When John asked me to do this a couple days ago, he also asked me not to step on the program I'm doing 2 months from now. So I'm going to step on it lightly, but I can't avoid it entirely. Once I came up with a title, I thought maybe I was all right, but we will see. I'm going to start with the Ross family, and we see here in the 1900 census the Nimrod Ross father, Ellen the mother, Pearl big sister, and Clinton Ross, who really will be my focus, the son. Actually, this is the 1910 because Clinton's aged a bit. Nimrod Ross has an interesting history in Lincoln. He arrives about 1900, and within a couple of years is one of the early African-American police officers on the Lincoln force. This is an image of about 1907, and centered, standing on what was called Black Maria, which was the police wagon of the time, is an African-American gentleman. Big, stout guy. I think that's Clinton Ross, in that we'll see in another view here, or Nimrod Ross, because Clinton Ross was definitely a big, stout guy, and typically, to some extent, like father, like son. Father Clinton, sometimes going by, or Father Nimrod, sometimes going by Charlie, gave an interview during the WPA period, 1933, And he reflected that when he had come to Lincoln about 1900, he said it was just a little burg, but things were a whole lot better then for colored folks than they are now. And that was, I think, not only the Depression, but the events of the teens and 20s. Lincoln had had a huge Klan, clavern in the 20s, occupations that had been more open, like the police force, and Nimrod had also been the turnkey, the jailer at the city jail, were no longer available to African Americans. And in his later years in the city directory, Nimrod was a janitor, a houseman for a Lincoln family, the kind of blue-collar menial occupations that were open to African American men in the early 20th century Lincoln. When Nimrod died, he was reported to be 106 years old. He was, I think, of sufficient age that he could report to be however old he chose to be. His family apparently did not believe that on his tombstone at Wyuka. Seems to be more accurate that he was born about 1865, although in that interview he gave the WPA, he said that he was born at the end of slavery and claimed his date then of 1864. And so while this one is carved in stone, it may not be precisely accurate either. Nimrod built a little house on South 30th Street, 445 South 30th Street in the Woods Park neighborhood, about 1903, and this is where his son Clinton would have grown up. This house is on the National Register of Historic Places because National Register properties can be architecturally significant, or they might be associated with a very prominent individual. It might be hard to make that case for Nimrod Ross, or they can be associated with a pattern, an important, significant pattern of events. And with both father and son really reflecting key stories of African American and heritage in Lincoln and race relations in Lincoln and discrimination history in Lincoln, we made the case successfully. Now, I have to admit, when we presented this to the state board, we enlisted, I think, 4 students from Elliott Elementary School to come over and present this case. If you're lobbying, if you can get about 4 fifth graders with you, you're probably going to succeed, and this one went through just beautifully. I'm going to shift to the son because Clinton gives us the professional aspect to the story. And when we think about Clinton Ross and start talking about somebody who attended Lincoln High, we picture a big, beautiful building on 21st and J Streets. Well, he went to Lincoln High started attending in 1906 and graduated in 1910. So he was on the Pershing Auditorium site of Lincoln High. And it wasn't even just that classic French Second Empire building of 1871, but the site was by then crowded with an elementary school, McKinley in the foreground, and an administration building on the north side. They didn't play football on site, but apparently, as I was reading for some of this preparation, the university didn't play always on site either. They sometimes played in Antelope Park and sometimes just found a place they could practice. But Clinton Ross started Lincoln High in 06. He was playing football by 07. I find in minor newspaper mentions. He gave the Gettysburg Address at school on February 12th, 1909, which would be Lincoln's birthday. And so he's, or what I call past President's Day. He graduated in 1910. I don't find a lot of mentions in the paper about the scores of Lincoln High football games. I maybe could have. I thought I could maybe occupy the whole period with football history, but I really can't. So forgive me for all the errors I will make. But I do find that in October 1910, when Clinton Ross has gone on now to the University of Nebraska, and he's playing for the freshman team there, there's a little report in the paper about the upcoming Hastings-Lincoln High game, and they say Hastings attributes their defeat last year to the presence of Clinton Ross on the Lincoln team. Ross is the big 211-pound guard on the university freshman team this year. With Ross out of the lineup, Hastings believes their chances are good. There will be much more about that kind of predictions as we get into a little more about Clinton Ross. Graduates 1910, goes on then to a 4 or 5 year academic career at the University of Nebraska, and is not necessarily, it's a little hard to read from the reports. If he's not the biggest guy on the Nebraska team in his years, he's up at the top edge. There are a couple other 200-pound players. They didn't seem to care how tall people were in football, but they often were reporting their size. By 1913, he was a key member of the team, and then we have very typical Lincoln reports that they're worried at the beginning of the season who's going to show up, who's injured, who's academically qualified, and they're worried that Ross might not play for what sound like very valid reasons. He wants to concentrate on his studies. His professors apparently don't want him to concentrate on his studies and talk him into donning his uniform. This is by October. They still haven't started their games, but they're much relieved that Ross is going to come out. And then, midway through the season, both Kansas and what becomes Kansas State, Kansas Agricultural at the time, decide that they don't want to play Nebraska if Ross is playing. And they try to play the race card, quite literally, that they present that there's a gentleman's agreement, which I think is like the term gentleman's club. It's the opposite of how the term is used, that players of color cannot are banned, but there is no agreement, there's nothing written, and University of Nebraska protests, particularly in the case of the Aggies, that they had played Nebraska the 2 preceding years with Ross on the team. Kansas was a new addition to their schedule because the year before, Nebraska had played Missouri and agreed by some prior arrangement to withhold Ross from the team for that game, and then they canceled Missouri from the schedule, added Kansas, and here Kansas, new to the schedule, is protesting the players. There's an awful lot of back and forth in the newspapers, both about this incident and about seemingly every game where they're protesting each other's players. And apparently, a lot of them were non-students, to put a term. In the write-up of on the Nebraska side, I'm sure the Kansas papers would read differently, and I didn't bother to read them because I'm presenting to you, and I'm presenting this topic. But they say that Clinton Ross is undoubtedly the greatest football player since the days of Flippin the fullback, who was the first African-American player on the team. There'd been a fellow named Bill Johnson who was playing in the first 4 or 5 years of the 20th century. They say he was good and he was fast, but there were a lot of fast men. They didn't have many like Ross of his size, and the team particularly would be weak without him. The athletic board at Nebraska, which was the board that would adjudicate protests from other teams about the eligibility of players, immediately settled that Ross was eligible. There was no agreement that Nebraska had made or would respect. And then Chancellor Avery made a very strong statement that Nebraska would only play that Nebraska would choose its players and would only play schools that would accept whatever players Nebraska chose. And if the other school instituted a color bar, Nebraska would cut them from participation. Nebraska wouldn't play teams that would ban Nebraska players of color. Avery then recommended to the regents that they adopt the same policy, and I believe that did occur. So that in the yearbook of 1914, looking back at the 1913 team, Ross is featured on the team. It's not a great picture of the whole team, but he's the fellow nearest he's seated on the far left-hand side, and then his portrait. He was a big guy. This I just had to put in because obviously the seriousness with which everyone took the sport at the time. They're on South 11th Street because there's Townsend Photo Studio who probably took this picture as well. And the steamed reference is E.O. Steam, who was the coach at the time. And so the team was the Steamrollers and lots of other, I assume it's pronounced steam because otherwise the puns make no sense at all. And the coach said of Ross in that sort of summary in 1914 when they finished 1913 season, while not flashy, is a pillar of strength. But for the wealth of material, which isn't the way I would want to have coaches refer to students, but that we may expect next fall, his absence would probably be a blow from which the team would not recover. What I particularly like is in what seems to be more a student-written part of that yearbook, they talk about Ross and note that at football rallies he has shown great oratorical ability, and there's no doubt but that he will make success as an attorney at law as he intends, provided Professor Robbins or some of the others do not put a crimp in his aspirations. I think they were done putting a crimp in his aspirations because he had played his 3 years of eligibility and then was allowed to focus on his classes, which he successfully did and graduated in 1915 with a law degree. It wasn't the same duration of study it is today, and was the first African-American individual, first African-American of either sex to graduate with a law degree from the University of Nebraska, and is practicing by 1916, and we find him successfully defending a client in the 1916 paper. Then war is brewing. He fills out the obligatory registration card for the draft and signs, I sometimes overinterpret signatures, but that's a very confident signature on the lower right, and lists his occupation as attorney, which he had every right to. That was exactly what he was, and it reports also, there's always that upper right-hand page, he reports that his figure is stout. He enlists in the Army and serves as a first lieutenant during World War I. And it would seem like if you were preparing for a successful professional career in Nebraska, particularly in Lincoln, you would be a football star, a University of Nebraska grad, and a veteran. In fact, he, except for apparently a few cases, can't find sufficient clients in Lincoln to practice and moves to Los Angeles. So that when he's filling out the form for older men registering prior to World War II or at World War II, he's registering from Los Angeles, where he's still practicing law, at this time working for the WPA. He dies in 1954 in Los Angeles, had never, except for those brief early years, practiced as a lawyer in Lincoln, although his education entirely had been public education in Lincoln, Nebraska. So these are my loss as we go along, and there will be more loss than win as we look at these early professionals. The next figure, A.B. Moss, or Arthur B. Moss, first appears in our Lincoln City directories as a waiter and is in Lincoln by about 1903, working at the Lindell Hotel and living in a downtown boarding house. We see him in the directories as a waiter 1903, 4, and 5. He's not in the Lincoln directories in 1906. We find out, if we keep following the trail, by 1911, he's back. He's a physician. He had gone to Chicago, attended a medical school named Jenner. His obituary will say that he graduated from Chicago Medical School. Same thing, it absorbed Jenner after Moss's attendance. So we see in his obit, he attended the University of Nebraska, and I've not been able to pin that down. but graduated from Jenner Medical College, comes back to Lincoln about 1910, and by 1911 is practicing as a physician in Lincoln, and practices here till 1938 when he dies at 58 years old. I've met folks who knew him as a physician. I've met a woman who was birthed by him as a physician, and the memory was he always looked tired. He was, I think, the small town doctor to the small town of African Americans in Lincoln, and that is a very tiring and not real lucrative occupation. He doesn't have a house of his own until 3 or 4 years before his death. He lived at 501 South 9th Street towards the end of his life in a little house. If you can picture the old K Street power plant, and right across the street from it's a little white building that does the geothermal work and heats the county city buildings. His house was where the geothermal plant was. At one time, a crane building an addition to the big power plant across the street fell down and crushed part of his house right across the street. Did not injure him. We find him in a few newspaper accounts. He practiced continually through the period as a physician. He's lodging his patients at the hospital, seems to have relations with some of the white physicians in town that they're often mentioned together in some of the little newspaper snippets. Newspaper accounts tend to be about troubles, and so we see him listed attending to people who've been injured in accidents or crimes. It would not be a real lucrative profession, although obviously a fully qualified and rather remarkable individual rising from waiter to physician in that brief period of years and coming back to practice here the rest of his career. Now, I can't resist offering John Johnson photos whenever I have a chance to. So forgive me in April, or don't come back, although it will be a different talk in April. But this is one of the John Johnson photos. He was the African-American photographer in Lincoln, active from about 1910 to 1926. And this is one of, I think, his most remarkable images. And this, I'm convinced, and I think I can convince you, is Dr. Moss. Most of these images survive as glass plate negatives, so there's no note written on the back of them. You have to go from internal evidence and whatever sources you can. But this young man, sitting with a examining table right in front of him and a skull on his desk, is not a waiter. It's also a period where nationally there is occurring in the teens and 20s what often is referred to as the Harlem Renaissance, but more broadly is the New Negro movement, which is what the NAACP rose out of, all of the art and literature of the Harlem Renaissance, and it essentially was civil rights and self-determination and self-definition. And I'll talk more in April about Johnson is, I think, a New Negro movement photographer, and he's working with his clients to present their self-image, not defined by a dominant culture, but defined by themselves and their own community. This is a very confident young man, which you would have to be to have gone off to Chicago and supported yourself probably as a waiter there while going to medical school, and then come back to practice in a bare room with pine walls, no wallpaper, but a phone on his desk and a self-image that I think comes out very strongly in the picture. An image we have of Moss from a 1938 dedication brochure for Newman Methodist Church, who had just opened a new church on North 23rd Street, and he published a little in support of the effort and advertisement in there. And there's Moss in his mature years, so just about the time of his death. And then Moss in his obituary is the same young man, more tired now, but the same young man we see in the Johnson photo. And he's interred at Wyuka Cemetery with this stone, Dr. Moss, husband. Now, the wins and losses both we'll talk about the Hill sisters, or really the whole Hill family. And there were several Hill families in Lincoln, including 2 or 3 African-American Hill families in Lincoln. This family is particularly remarkable. We see them here in the 1920 census when Mother Eliza with her children PME, which was also the initials by which the father of these children went, Tizonia, Brevi, Zacadine, or Zanzi and Zacadine. Not typical names by any account. Brevi, the older sister, shows up in Johnson images. And here she is with her husband, Mr. Lilly. But the sisters I want to concentrate on are Zanzi to the left and Zacadine to the right. I love yearbooks. They give you pictures with names and dates. And these sisters attended Lincoln High, and both of their yearbook pictures show up. Zanzi on the left is the older sister. That's the 1924 yearbook, and her younger sister, Zacadine, in 1928. These names, according to the father, who is another subject of some of the oral history collected by the WPA projects in the 1930s, reports that their family had come from the Yoruban tribe in Africa, and he was naming his kids for typical Yoruban names. There are parts of that story that, as I've researched the family line and the father, may not be strictly precise, but I think they're more true, whether they're precise or not, in that he raised a family of children where one daughter became the first law graduate of the University of female black law graduate of the University of Nebraska, and the other an MD. He had brilliant children, and whatever the family lore was that inspired these children to the self-image to get through what they got through and reach the point they did was true. And it doesn't matter whether the father's original name was Pinky in Mississippi. I think what matters is how the family regarded themselves and what they achieved in their lives. Look first at Zanzi, who graduates in 1929. There's her mature picture as first black woman law graduate, first black woman admitted to the Nebraska bar. She goes to Arkansas and is chief counsel for a law firm there, and then dies very young and is interred back in the family town of Lincoln at Wyuka Cemetery. Another of the Lincoln educated, public school, public university, professional degree, but the opportunities for her were all external to Lincoln. So a win and a loss simultaneous. And then her sister, in Zanzi's obit, it notes that her sister was studying medicine in Nashville, Tennessee, when Zanzi died. Zacadine then goes on to finish her. Nashville tells us, and later accounts support, that her sister went to Meharry, one of the most prominent of the African American medical schools, graduates in 1937 with an MD, serves her internship in New Orleans, and then is on staff at a St. Louis, Missouri hospital. Unlike Dr. Moss, and maybe knowing that Dr. Moss, at the time she graduated, was still practicing in Lincoln, doesn't see the opportunity to return to Lincoln, and we lose her to St. Louis. So comes from this community, can't come back and practice in this community. One of the most remarkable of the figures, and I'm cheating only a little here in claiming Aaron Douglas, because he is not from Lincoln, but his art education was from Lincoln. Aaron Douglas was what we have here is his high school graduation picture. He's a Kansan. His mother apparently was an artist, and he had some art training in high school, but he comes on to the University of Nebraska to become a college student and an art student explicitly. He's going to become a teacher, although only for several periods in his career. But I have to reflect back on the Board of Education minutes that Lincoln Public Schools Board of Education, all the way back in 1886, reported another petition has been received from the colored people of Lincoln asking for representation in the Corps of Teachers. The petition was placed on file. This obviously was not even the first ask. No African Americans were hired by Lincoln Public Schools, although the student body included African Americans, till after World War II. And that's going to then affect the whole next group of individuals we'll look at who taught elsewhere but never taught in Lincoln. We have here the art club, and this is a remarkable picture from the University of Nebraska, the Cornhusker yearbooks. It's one of the only pictures I find in the teens or 20s where we see an African American in one of the club photos. We see individual portraits senior year sometimes, but here we have Aaron Douglas on the far left, member of the art club. Newspaper accounts are clear. There's a little published notice that the new members of the club included Aaron Douglas. He's up there a little bit enlarged. As Cindy's fine article this morning noted, Aaron Douglas was very successful with the, very highly regarded by the faculty at the university. There was a request that came in apparently to the faculty that General Pershing was visiting Lincoln, and that they needed an art student to enlarge a Kodak, they said, a photographic portrait, to kind of banner size for Pershing's visit. And they picked Aaron Douglas, faculty picked Aaron Douglas and gave him that assignment, or made that request. And he spent the Christmas vacation doing this, what sounds like was huge, something like 6 foot by 6 foot portrait in charcoal from this photograph. I then had to make a link. If I've got an African American New Negro Movement photographer in Lincoln practicing at the very same time that Aaron Douglas is in school, I want to link them together. Not because I think John Johnson taught Aaron Douglas what he learned about art or the other direction, but rather they're in this same fairly small African American community of Lincoln at the same moment in time and place. So we have here the high school graduation and the college graduation photos of Aaron Douglas. Obviously a maturing over his college years. Hopefully all of us mature at least a little bit during our college years. But can I find him in the photos of John Johnson? And there are these images of what look like church youth groups in the park on Sunday afternoon. Now there's no time stamp on these images, but they have that kind of Sunday afternoon leisure and nicely dressed. And there's a young man on the left-hand side of this image. And Johnson often reshuffled and took another picture on the same day. And these are the same 16 people, just shuffled a bit. And the young man to the left here, and I've enlarged and circled that guy. If we take our 3 college-era photos of Douglas and intersperse those Johnson images, I think we've got Aaron Douglas sitting for John Johnson's camera. He's part of that same environment. We also find, when we look closely at where Aaron Douglas was living, he's either living with or next door to folks that were frequent subjects of Johnson's cameras, and I can identify several of them. It's where they are and when it is that this overlap occurs. Douglas goes on to, briefly in Lincoln, he runs after he graduates, he runs a lunch cart with some other young African Americans of Lincoln, which basically is a noontime below a restaurant, but above he's not making deliveries for Pickleman, but it's kind of on that line. And then leaves Lincoln for high school teaching job in Kansas City, a job he couldn't hold in Lincoln. It's a quarter century too early. From Kansas City, he goes on to New York City and becomes there the leading graphic artist of the New Negro movement, and particularly of the Harlem Renaissance, with this wonderful combination style of kind of Art Deco, African imagery infused Art Deco, and he's working with the most prominent figures in the most prominent publications of that period. Then goes on to Fisk University and becomes the chairman of the art department there. Has a very successful higher education academic career, but not at Nebraska, but rather at a historically black college. Now his works are in the Sheldon, his works are in the Museum of Nebraska Art in Kearney, and these are some of those. Here he is in his mature years and his own self-portrait in his later years. A portrait of him by others is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, and he's very well known now as really the leading 20th century African American artist and really a foundational artist of that time, and now is known to have this connection to Kansas and Nebraska. It isn't that he got to Harlem and drank the water and became a genius. He was a trained academic artist coming from where we are and from the university here. But doesn't teach here. And so I'm looking at some other teachers who don't teach here. And one of them is a man named Wayman Ferguson. I'm not sure I found his portrait, but he has a master's degree from Ohio State, comes on to the University of Nebraska for further study in agriculture. 1920 census, there's a very intriguing entry that says he's a teacher of public schools. I've been through the archives as far as I can get through them at LPS, and I can't find any Lincoln Public School where he's listed on faculty or anything in the tradition. And in the directories, he's a waiter, a laborer, and a driver in the 1920s, the typical occupations I find for African American men in the 20s. I think the census entry may be aspirational. He's qualified as a teacher. He should be a teacher. He wants to be a teacher, and he wants to be in the public schools. But that isn't, so that could be an occupation, not an employment. And census is always a bit of a grab bag, as where the information comes from and how precisely accurate it is. 1930 directory, he's again listed as a teacher. And then he goes on to Georgia and teaches at Tuskegee, and then on to Florida. And he and his wife are both teachers at Florida Normal University. So he is a trained, qualified, and eventually employed academic, but not that I can document in Lincoln. Here's the college list from the Florida. Now I get intrigued by this Johnson photo because if you know your details of the front entry of Lincoln High, that's where this group of students are standing. I don't think they're high school students. They look too young. And one of them, or a couple of the little girls in the front, if you see what they're holding and zoom way in on it, it's music, sheet music. So I think maybe they're at Lincoln High, and probably the pretty new Lincoln High, which opens 1915, and that's right in the center of when Johnson's taking his photos. They're there probably for a music recital of some kind. There's faculty in the view towards the back, some very severe looking ladies. And then one African American gentleman standing to the back. I don't know who this is. If we get way in, I think he's got glasses on. He's got a nice crisp collar, and that's all I've got. Is this Ollie Ferguson with a connection to Lincoln High? We think we've just recently found a connection that Johnson is a janitor at Lincoln High at this time, but that's not John Johnson. I know his face well, but somebody. Now, I do know these people, and one of them actually I knew in person. The little girl seated with her family. This is another teacher story. The Talbert family, another Johnson photo. Sitting in front is Ruth Talbert Green Foley, Mrs. Foley, who I met when she was 95. This is about 1913. She's about 8 years old. Her father, Albert Talbert, was the minister at Newman Methodist Church. And at that time, Newman was not on 23rd Street. It was on 7th and J, right across from where StarTrans barn is now. Hard to imagine, but about where the little LES substation is. It was this humble little wooden church. His father was minister. Her brother's name was Dakota, standing right behind her, and her mother was Millicent. And this is the Mrs. Foley that I met, looking a lot like that little girl. She was a key figure in the John Johnson research in that we were carefully guided to her when we were doing the research and weren't sure who the photographer even was. And I think people who knew that she knew guided us to her, and we were talking about a photograph that we have the negative, or it belongs to a man in California. And she went to her bedroom, came back with her family photos, and said, "Mr. Johnson took my picture. Mr. Johnny Johnson took my picture." And she had the picture and knew and remembered him. Her father would have Johnson come to Newman Church events for bazaars or the various things that minister might want to record. And she then donated her family pictures, which included almost 24 Johnson pictures, to the State Historical Society before her death. But part of her story, here's her family Bible, which is part of that donation. She went on to Lincoln High, 1924, and graduated that year in the college prep track, went on to the University of Nebraska, took a 2-year course and obtained a teaching certificate, which was sufficient at that time for a teaching certificate. In fact, much better qualified than many of the teachers, much better educated teachers around Nebraska at the time, but never taught, in that she wanted to stay in Lincoln, not leave somewhere else to a segregated school system. Here the student body wasn't segregated, but no African American teachers were being hired. When I co-authored the Lincoln in Black and White book, my dedication was to her as never a classroom but always a teacher. Some of the other Johnson photos, this is Millard T. and Delmer Woods. These are the Woods brothers. You've heard of the Woods brothers? These are the Woods brothers. And their mother, Lizzie. Their father was William, who was the houseman, kind of butler, all-round service worker at the governor's mansion through half a dozen governors, something like 30 plus years. He was the man who kept the house running, a leader in his community. William and Lizzie, Elizabeth, encouraged their son Millard, the very tall man on the far left here, with a group of African American students, friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, on the administration building steps in the late 1920s. Millard went to the University of Nebraska, received a pharmacy degree, and we see, and I've not been able to explain, but often African American students or other students of color were taking pharmacy degrees. He goes on then and teaches in Texas, in a college, and he's a high school principal in Arizona. His parents, in the early 30s, when tough conditions are really tough in Lincoln, encourage Millard to come back. He agrees and comes back and founds his first executive director of the Lincoln Urban League, which becomes in the 30s the Clyde Malone Center. So Millard T. Woods does come back to Lincoln, not as a teacher, but as the executive director of that key Lincoln institution, which still exists. And I maybe jumped the gun a little bit, but having done all of that loss, I do want to cite Forrest Stith, the first African-American teacher hired by Lincoln Public Schools. He'd been a chaplain in the Army in World War II and is teaching at Millard Leffler when he's first hired. He was the Newman Methodist pastor as well, had a master's degree from UNL, and taught for about 20 years from 55 to 75. And there isn't a Stith Elementary School, but there is a Maxey Elementary School, another of the early. Joanne Maxey was the first African-American school board member, and then member of the legislature, and Colonel Paul Adams, Adams Elementary School, another very early African-American teacher at Lincoln High in the industrial arts arena, and he had been, during World War II, a Tuskegee Airman, and that very prominent, fascinating group of individuals comes then to Lincoln, teaches at Lincoln High throughout the rest of his career. So I had to put in some wins because I have to do a few more losses to finish up. We have here Clyde Malone, the young man standing behind his father-in-law, Mr. Cowley. The little tiny figure beside Clyde is Izetta Cowley, little I think only in stature, and that is her family, mother and father and her sister beside her. Izetta and Cowley were married until his death in 1951. They had one daughter. She became a social worker in Ohio. I had the good fortune, I never met her, but except by phone and email as we were researching some of these images. And she identified that she didn't have this picture, but she knew everybody in it because it was her mother, father, aunt, and grandparents. And after we talked a while, she said she had some family papers and materials and images, and she would make copies of them. And I said, if you would please send those to me, I'd be so grateful. She said, no, nobody in Ohio knows anything about my father and his family. I'm keeping the copies and sending you the originals. Keep them in Lincoln where people will look when they want to know about my father and my family. Johnson took two pictures, hats on, hats off, hats and dog, and no hats and no dog. Among those papers was a little autobiographical statement by Clyde Malone saying that after high school, I got bit by the matrimonial bug, and I asked Izetta Cowley of the Missouri Cowleys to marry me. She said I do, and she's been doing ever since. This is the young Clyde Malone. This is the young Clyde Malone in a John Johnson image, and I would say this is also a new Negro movement picture. A young man of confidence and comfort to be photographed reclining in his knickers with his ankles crossed and a dandelion in his hand. This is, but if I looked like that, maybe I would be that confident too. He becomes, he serves in World War I, attends UNL, University of Nebraska at that time, becomes an insurance executive outside Lincoln, and then somewhat like Millard T. Woods is recruited to come back to Lincoln. He had been doing community service work in, I believe it was Minneapolis, and he comes back to Lincoln and is Millard T. Woods' first assistant by the late 30s. And when Woods, who was younger, goes off for World War II service, and Malone had been a generation older and had served in World War I, then Clyde Malone became the executive director of the Lincoln Urban League. And on his death in 51, Izetta takes over leadership, and the name is changed to the Clyde Malone Center a couple of years later. And this is Izetta with the formal portrait of Clyde Malone. So again, here we had two figures who, I think there's brain drain. Here we had brain regain, where both Millard T. Woods and Clyde Malone were able to come back to Lincoln and serve the community And then maybe the most unusual of these occupations and professions was a brother-in-law of Clyde Malone, another lieutenant in the Army in World War I with Clinton Ross, and this was Horace Cowley. And Clyde wrote up an article on his brother-in-law, who was a professional furrier. He had started in Lincoln, went on to some of the bigger cities in the fur trade, and then came back to Lincoln, established his own fur business in this big house on South 11th Street in Lincoln. And there he's at his desk transacting fur business, I guess. But probably the most unusual of these bright entrepreneurial Lincoln early professionals. With that, we have a few minutes that I can take questions. If I answer them, I'll also tell you after I answer them whether I'm just making it up or not.
It's my understanding that the University of Nebraska, after the standing up for Clinton Ross incident, then closed the football team to black players for many decades. Can you confirm that?
The question is whether the University of Nebraska, after standing by Clinton Ross in 1913, reversed themselves, and I believe that is the case. I'm not a football scholar, but I believe that is the case, that we don't see other African American players for quite a long time in many sports in the University of Nebraska. And I know Albert Maxey, and when he returns and is playing basketball many decades later, there are not very many African American players at that moment, quite a bit later.
I noticed that you have a couple pictures before the woman that was last name Maxey.
Yes.
Was she related to the LPD officer that escorted Martin Luther King?
The question is whether Joanne Maxey is related to Albert Maxey, who was the Lincoln police officer who was Martin Luther King's bodyguard when he visited Lincoln. Absolutely, husband and wife. She died of cancer a couple decades ago. Albert, blessedly, is still with us. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Is this house still there? Is this about a D Street or so?
The question is whether this house in the picture on South 11th Street is still there. It is. It's at about, it's a couple of blocks south of A on a northwest corner. Big house. I think it has an enclosed porch now, so it looks a little different, but the house is still there. So far, most of those answers have been true to the best of my knowledge.
I was curious about that Art Deco poster by Aaron Douglas of someone named Fawcett. Was that for an exhibit or?
The question is about the Aaron Douglas image of a poster, and I think that was a magazine cover or a publication cover. And he did paintings, he did a lot of murals and some very large-scale murals. They were some of his most significant work, and then obviously the easel work we see, but also a lot of graphic design type assignments.
Any update on, or have the whereabouts of the portrait that he did of Pershing? As to
Question is whether we know anything about the location of the portrait of Pershing. It says in the newspaper article that it was displayed in Lincoln at the Pershing headquarters, and then went to Omaha to the Pershing headquarters in 1920, and that's the last I know of it. We also, in these articles, there's a fascinating mention, and Cindy Lang Kubik in her story about Douglas this morning mentioned him doing a painting for a music institute in Colorado. That was a Lincoln professor's summer music institute. And I sure would like to know if that painting exists, which would be Aaron Douglas painting Crater Lake in Colorado. So I give that to all of you to figure out. We're down to our last minute, so if we have a last question, I'll make up a fake answer to this one. Thank you for relieving me of that responsibility. I know now, if I want really good attendance, we list a different speaker and we offer lunch.